At 9:11 on a Tuesday night, my father made a phone call that nobody in my family knew about. He was 78 years old. He had 11 hours left to live. He couldn't hold a glass of water without both hands. And somewhere in that failing body there was still enough of him left to pick up a phone, dial a number he had written on the back of a pharmacy receipt, and say 8 words to a complete stranger. "I need to change something before I go." For days later, 22 people sat in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building downtown. My brother Vincent sat at the head of the table like he was running the meeting. He had a leather folder in front of him. He had already told the family what the will said. He had told them for years. 70% to him. 25 to my sister. 5 to me, if I behaved. Then the door opened, and a woman none of us had ever seen before walked in, set a folder on the table, and said, "Good morning. My name is Naomi Fisk. I'm the attorney who drafted Raymond Cole's final will and testament on the evening of March 11th. I watched my brother's face. I watched it happen in real time, the second the word final landed, and the second word after it that mattered more. 11th. Because the will Vincent had in that leather folder was dated 2019. And my father had died on the 12th. My name is Adam Cole. I'm 43 years old. For 3 years I lived in my father's house, cleaned him, fed him, drove him to appointments, and got called a parasite for it at every family dinner. And what that lawyer read out loud in the next 40 minutes ended my brother's career, his marriage, and every single thing he thought he had earned. This is exactly how it happened. You need to understand my father before you can understand what he did. Raymond Cole grew up in a house with a dirt cellar and left school at 16. He spent 4 years in a shipyard, then 31 running a machine shop on Pratt Street that made parts nobody has ever heard of for machines nobody ever thinks about. Bearing housings. Valve seats. The kind of work where nobody knows your name and everything falls apart if you do it wrong. He had a phrase he used maybe 400 times in my life. He said it to me when I was 9 and I wanted a trophy for a science fair I hadn't won. He said, "You don't tell people who you are. You let the work tell them." My father believed that the way other men believe in religion. And it made him magnificent at building things and completely, catastrophically bad at seeing through people who talked well. Which brings me to my brother. Vincent is 6 years older than me. Vincent went to college, then got a certification, then another one, and by 31 he had his own financial advisory practice with his name on the glass, Cole Wealth Partners. 3 employees. A view of the water. And Vincent understood something about our father that I didn't understand until I was almost 40. He understood that a man who spent his whole life being invisible has a hunger. Not for money. For legitimacy. For someone in the family to be the kind of person who has a view of the water. My father was so proud of Vincent that it made him stupid. Then there's my sister, Claire. 2 years younger than Vincent, 3 years older than me. Claire married a man named Grant Bennett who owns 11 car dealerships and calls himself an entrepreneur. Claire's job in this family was simple. Claire agreed with Vincent. Out loud. In front of people. Every single time. And then there was me. I did HVAC. Commercial systems, mostly, hospitals, schools, one water treatment plant. I made a decent living. Not a great one. I got divorced at 34, no kids, and I lived in a rented condo with a balcony I never used. In my family, that made me the disappointment. Not because I was one. Because somebody had to be, and I was the one who didn't argue. Here's the thing about being the disappointment in a family like mine. It's a job. It has responsibilities. Your responsibility is to make everybody else feel like they made the right choices. You show up at Christmas, you take the smaller chair, you get asked, "How's work?" in that particular voice, and everybody goes home feeling successful. I did that job for about 15 years. I was good at it. Then, in March of the year my father turned 75, he fell in the driveway and couldn't get back up, and lay there for 40 minutes until the mail carrier found him. Parkinson's. Diagnosed late, moving fast. Layered on top of a heart that had already had one bypass and was not enthusiastic about a second. I want you to understand exactly how the next conversation went, because everything that happens for the rest of this story comes out of a single dinner in a hospital cafeteria. Vincent laid it out with a legal pad. He'd already researched facilities. There was a place called Cedar Hollow, 90 minutes north, that he described as genuinely lovely. $8,200 a month. He said the house on Pratt Street could be sold to cover it and there'd be meaningful surplus. Claire said, Vincent's looked into all of it. And my father, who was sitting right there, my father, who could still walk, who could still finish a crossword, who had run a business for 31 years, my father was not asked a single question. He sat there with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and listened to his children plan where he was going to die. I remember looking at his hands. They were shaking a little, and I couldn't tell if it was the disease or something else. And I said something I had never said to my family in my entire adult life. I said, no. Vincent didn't even look up. He said, Adam, it's $8,000 a month, this isn't really a vote. And I said, I'll move in. 11 days later I ended my lease, put most of what I owned in a storage unit off Route 9, and moved into the back bedroom of the house I grew up in. I was 40 years old. What I want to say about the 3 years that followed is that they were hard, and that I'd do them again. I built a ramp. I moved his bed downstairs. I learned how to give a man his dignity while wiping him, which is a skill nobody teaches you and everybody should know. I learned which pill made him nauseous and which one made him talk too much and which combination gave us about 90 good minutes in the late morning. I took a pay cut to go part-time. Then I took another one. My savings went from $31,000 to $4,000 over about 20 months. And in those 90 good minutes every morning, my father talked to me more than he had in the first 40 years of my life combined. He told me about the shipyard. He told me about a girl he almost married in 1968. He told me that my mother knew about the money problems in 1994 and never once mentioned them, and that he thought about that every day for 30 years. And one morning, sitting in the kitchen with the light coming in sideways, he said something I didn't think about again for 3 years. He said, "Your mother made me promise something, at the end. She said whichever one of you was still standing in the room when it got ugly, that's the one who was telling the truth the whole time." I said, "That's kind of grim, Dad." He said, "She was a grim woman. She was right about everything." He kept a brass key ring on his nightstand. 4 keys. The shop on Pratt Street had been sold in 2009, the building was a vape store now, but he kept the keys. I asked him about it once. He said, "A man should be able to prove he built something." Now, here is the part where it turns. Thanksgiving, year 2. 14 people in that dining room. My father at the head of the table in his chair, which I had spent 40 minutes getting him into because he wanted to be at the table and not in the hospital bed in the den. He was wearing a tie. He hadn't worn a tie in 2 years. And between the main course and dessert, Vincent stood up, tapped his glass, and said he wanted to address something as a family, openly, because that's how we do things. He pulled a folder out of a bag under his chair. He said, "Adam has been living in Dad's home for 22 months, rent-free, and I think we should get that formalized. For everyone's protection." He slid the folder down the table. 14 people watched it slide. It was 6 pages. It was titled Residential Caregiver Services Agreement. And what it actually did, underneath the language, was reclassify me. Not as a son. As a hired employee. $400 a week. Room and board considered part of compensation. A clause requiring 30 days notice for termination, by either party. A confidentiality provision. And on page 5, in a paragraph titled Acknowledgement of Consideration, a line stating that the signer acknowledged that all compensation for caregiving services was fully satisfied by the terms of the agreement, and waived any future claim against the estate arising from those services. Read that again slowly if you need to. I had to read it 4 times at the table with everyone watching me. My brother, at Thanksgiving, in front of my father, handed me a document that turned 3 years of my life into a wage, and then made me sign away my right to ever call it anything else. And my sister said, "I think it's really generous, actually. Here's what I want you to notice, because this is the part people miss. Vincent didn't do that for $400 a week. Vincent is a financial advisor. $400 a week is nothing to him. He did it because a caregiver child who lives in the house for 3 years has a claim. In most states, that claim has a name and a history in courts that have honored it. He wasn't paying me. He was closing a door. I said, "I'm not signing this." Vincent smiled and said, "That's fine. Nobody's forcing you. I just think when there's money involved, families should be clear." And then he said the line. The one I still hear. He said, "Because otherwise it starts to look like you moved in for a reason." 14 people. Nobody said anything. My cousin Dale looked at his plate. My aunt refilled a glass that was already full. And then my father, who had said maybe 9 words all night, who everybody had stopped talking to somewhere around month 8 of that diagnosis and started talking about. My father put his fork down. It took him a long time. His hands didn't cooperate. The fork made a noise against the plate and everyone heard it, and the room went quiet in the way rooms do when an old man is about to say something. He said, "Vincent." Vincent said, "Yeah, Dad." And my father said, "Sit down." That's it. 2 words. Vincent laughed, made a joke about how he'd been told, and sat down, and dessert came out, and everybody moved on like it was a funny moment. But I was the one sitting 3 feet from my father, and I saw his face when Vincent turned around. And it was not the face of a confused old man who'd had enough of the noise. It was the face of a man who had just seen something and filed it. For months later, March, cold, wet, I came back from the pharmacy at about 2 in the afternoon and there was a lockbox on the front door. You know the kind. Gray, combination dial, hangs off the doorknob. Realtors use them so agents can show a property when the owner isn't there. I stood on that porch with a paper bag of prescriptions in my hand for probably 90 seconds, just looking at it. I called the number on the tag. A woman named Priya answered, very pleasant, and confirmed that yes, the property at 46, Pratt Street was under a listing agreement, signed February 28, and that they were doing a pre-market walkthrough Thursday. I asked who signed it. She said, the owner. Raymond Cole. And there's a power of attorney on file, Vincent Cole. I went inside. My father was awake. It was a good day, one of the good ones. He'd done the crossword, he was watching a documentary about bridges. I sat down on the edge of the bed and I said, Dad. Are we selling the house? And he looked at me and he said, what? I said it again. And he said, and I'm going to give you his exact words, because I wrote them down that night. He said, Adam, I'd sooner burn it. I got a copy of the listing agreement 2 days later. And the signature on it was my father's signature. Sort of. Here's what I mean. Parkinson's does a specific thing to handwriting. It's called micrographia. The letters get smaller and tighter as the hand fatigues, and the line quality gets shaky in a very particular way. My father's signature in 2024 looked nothing like his signature in 2019. I had watched it change month by month on pharmacy forms and bank slips. The signature on that listing agreement was large, loose, confident. It looked like my father's signature from about 2016. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not an expert and I never proved that specific document was forged. What I know is what my father said when I put it in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. And he said, "He brought me papers." I said, "When?" He said, "There's always papers. Insurance. Medicare." He says sign here and I sign there. That was the day I understood the actual architecture of what was happening. Vincent had power of attorney. He'd gotten it in 2021, 3 months after the diagnosis, at a kitchen table, with Claire as witness, while my father was on a medication that made him agreeable to almost anything for about 4 hours a day. And, "There's always papers," meant that for 3 years, my brother had been walking into that house with a stack of documents, putting them in front of a man with a degenerative neurological condition, and saying sign here. I didn't know what was in that stack. I wouldn't know for another 8 months. I called Vincent. He was calm. He is always calm. That's the thing about him, he never raises his voice, he just explains why you're upset about nothing. He said, "It's an exploratory listing, Adam. We're testing the market. Nothing's happening." I said, "He doesn't want to sell the house." And Vincent said, "He also doesn't want to take his blood pressure medication. We don't let him decide that either." I said, "He's not incompetent, Vince. He did the crossword this morning." And my brother said, quietly, reasonably, the way you'd tell someone their car needs an oil change. "Not yet. I want you to sit with that for 1 second. Not he isn't. Not of course he's not. Not yet." That was March. The lockbox came off the door 2 weeks later after I told the realtor there was a dispute over authority. Vincent never mentioned it again. Claire told 2 relatives that I had sabotaged the sale for personal reasons. And I thought I'd won something. I hadn't. I just told my brother that I was paying attention. Which meant he had to move faster. In August, my brother took my father to a doctor I'd never heard of. I found out because I was doing the pill counts and there was an appointment reminder card in his jacket pocket for a practice out in Wexford, 40 minutes away, in a specialty I couldn't pronounce. Vincent had driven him. Told me it was a follow-up with cardiology. It wasn't cardiology. It was a capacity evaluation. If you don't know what that is, it's a clinical assessment of whether a person has the mental capacity to make legal and financial decisions. And it matters enormously, because a person who has been formally assessed as lacking capacity cannot make a new will, cannot change one, cannot revoke one. Whatever will exists at the moment capacity is lost, that's the one that stands forever. The will that existed was dated 2019. 70, 25, 5. The assessment came back on August 19. I have read it many times since. It is 4 pages long. It describes a patient who was disoriented to date, unable to reliably recall recent financial transactions, and demonstrating impaired executive function consistent with moderate-stage neurocognitive decline. It was conducted at 4:40 in the afternoon. My father's good window, every single day, for 3 years, was between 9:30 and 11 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon he was tired. By 4:30 he was, on most days, barely present. Everyone who spent any real time with him knew that. It was on a laminated card on the refrigerator, because that's when I told visitors to come. Vincent scheduled that evaluation for 4:40 in the afternoon. And that's not a theory. That's not me guessing. That's a scheduling choice made by a man who had a laminated card on the refrigerator. 11 days after that report, on a Friday, I came back from a supply run and my key didn't work. The locks had been changed. There was a woman I didn't know in the kitchen, an agency nurse Vincent had hired. There were 2 police officers in the driveway. And there was a document, which one of the officers handed me, that referenced an allegation of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The allegation was that I had been isolating my father, obstructing family access, and had made unauthorized withdrawals from his account. The withdrawals were groceries. $940 over 3 months, from an account he had added me to himself, in 2022, in front of a bank employee, on video, because he wanted me to be able to buy his food. But that takes 6 weeks to establish. And in the meantime, I was standing on a lawn. 11 days. That's how long I was out of that house. I stayed at a Days Inn off Route 9, near my storage unit, which felt like some kind of joke. I called Adult Protective Services myself, which surprised everyone including me, and I called a lawyer I couldn't afford, and I called my father's landline 40 times and the agency nurse answered every time and said he was resting. On day 6 I sat in a parking lot and cried for about 20 minutes, which I had not done since my divorce, and I want to include that here because I think people tell these stories like they were strong the whole time and I wasn't. I thought I had lost. I genuinely thought that was the end. On day 11 the allegation was closed as unsubstantiated. Vincent said there had been a misunderstanding, and that he was glad it was resolved. I got a new key. I went back in. And my father was in that bed, and he had lost 9 pounds in 11 days, and when I walked in he looked at me and his eyes did something I had never seen them do. He said, "Where did you go?" And I said, "I didn't go anywhere, Dad. They wouldn't let me in." He was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "They told me you left." I sat down on the floor next to that bed and I held his hand and I said, "I'm not going anywhere. Ever. That's it. That's the whole thing." And my father, 78 years old, 9 pounds lighter, 11 days of being told his son had abandoned him. My father said, "Get me Teresa's number." Teresa Alvarado was the hospice nurse who'd been coming 3 times a week since June. And I didn't know why he wanted her number, and I didn't ask, and I gave it to him. That was the 22nd of February. I'm going to tell you this part the way I learned it, which is not the way I lived it. Because I was asleep. On March 11th, at 9:11 in the evening, my father called Naomi Fisk. He got her number from Teresa. Teresa had gotten it from a hospice social worker who kept a short list of attorneys who did what Fisk did, which was estate work for terminally ill clients, on short notice, at bedside, with a specific and hard-earned specialty in documenting capacity. Fisk told me later that in 14 years she has taken maybe 200 of those calls. And that my father's was, and I'm quoting her, the most organized she'd ever received from a man that ill. Because he had been getting ready. For a while. Here's what my father had, in a folder, in the drawer of his nightstand, under the brass key ring. The care agreement Vincent handed me at Thanksgiving. The listing agreement from February with the signature on it. A copy of the capacity evaluation, which he had asked Teresa to obtain for him through the patient portal. The police report from the 11 days. And a spiral notebook, the kind you buy at a gas station, in which my father, with a hand that could barely hold a pen, had been writing dates. February 4th, V brought papers. 3 pages. Did not read. February 19th, V says house too big. Says Adam agrees. Adam does not agree. August 30th, Adam gone. C says he took money. Do not believe. 41 entries. Over 2 years. My father, who left school at 16, who couldn't work a smartphone, who I had been treating for 3 years like a man I needed to protect. Had been building a case. Naomi Fisk arrived at 10:50 that night with a paralegal, a video camera, and a notary. Teresa was there. So was a hospice chaplain named Robert Mensa, who'd stopped in that evening and stayed. They did it in the den. They did it with the camera running from the first second to the last. And the reason they ran that camera, the reason Fisk always runs that camera, is the exact reason my brother scheduled an appointment for 4:40 in the afternoon. Because Vincent's entire plan rested on one claim, that our father was too far gone to change anything. So Fisk spent 51 minutes on video, before a single word of the will was discussed, establishing that he wasn't. She asked him the date. She asked him the name of the president. She asked him to identify each of his 3 children, to state what he believed each of them did for a living, and to describe, in his own words, what a will is and what it does. She asked him to name the assets he believed he owned. He named all of them, including one that Vincent did not know existed. And then she asked him why he was doing this at 11 o'clock at night. My father said, and this is on video, and I have watched it more times than is healthy. Because tomorrow I might not be able to. And I've waited long enough. I've been waiting to see who was going to still be in the room. He signed at 12:14 in the morning on March 12. Notary stamp. 2 witnesses. Video from beginning to end. He died at 8:20 that same morning, in that bed, with me in the chair next to him, having said nothing about any of it. I slept through the whole thing in the back bedroom, 40 feet away. He never told me. Not one word. Not that night, not in the morning. I asked Fisk about that, later. Why he wouldn't tell me. And she said, Mr. Cole, he was very specific about that. He said if you knew, you'd have tried to talk him into being fair. 9th floor. 4 days later. 22 people, because Vincent had invited half the extended family, which tells you everything about how confident he was. He had catered it. There was a coffee service. My brother catered our father's will reading. He'd brought his own attorney, a man named Doug Halloran, and the 2 of them sat at the head of the table with the 2019 will in a leather folder, and Vincent stood up at 10 o'clock and started to speak about Dad's legacy. He got about 90 seconds in. Then the door opened. Good morning. My name is Naomi Fisk. I'm the attorney who drafted Raymond Cole's final will and testament on the evening of March 11th. I have never in my life heard a room go that quiet that fast. 22 people and you could hear the air conditioning. Halloran stood up. Said something about proper notice. Fisk said she'd filed with the Register of Wills on March 14th, that his office had been served, and that she had the receipt. Vincent said, "This is not, Dad was not capable of executing a document on March 11th. And Fisk said, "I'd like to address that first, actually." And she turned the laptop around. They watched 11 minutes of it. Fisk had cued the segment. My father, at 11:20 at night, naming the date, naming his children, explaining what a will does, clearly, slowly, with pauses, but clearly. And then the part where Fisk asks him, Mr. Cole, has anyone pressured you or influenced you to make these changes? And my father says, no. That's the opposite of what happened. I watched my aunt put her hand over her mouth. I watched my cousin Dale turn around and look at Vincent, and it was the first time in my life I'd seen anyone in my family look at Vincent that way. Fisk closed the laptop and read the will. It was not what I expected. It was not a revenge document. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect the old man to have written something cruel. He didn't. It was worse than that. It was precise. 1. The house at 46, Pratt Street, and the 2 acres it sits on, to me. Outright. With a stated reason written into the document, which you're allowed to do, and which almost nobody does, reading, to my son Adam, who lived in it with me. 2. To Claire, 1/3 of the residuary estate. 3. To Vincent, and Fisk read this in exactly the same flat professional tone as everything else. To my son Vincent, I leave the sum of $1, and my acknowledgement that he knows why. Somebody's phone buzzed. Nobody picked it up. 4. A no contest clause. In legal terms, in terrorem. Meaning, any beneficiary who challenges the will forfeits everything they were left under it. 5. And this is the one that ended him. The will directed the executor to commission an independent forensic accounting of every transaction executed under the power of attorney held by Vincent Cole from 2021 forward, and to refer the findings, in full, to the State Attorney General's Elder Justice Unit and to the securities regulator that licensed him. Not to sue him. Not to accuse him. Just to look. And to make sure the right people looked with him. And then Fisk said, the named executor is Adam Cole. And then she got to the schedule of assets. And here's where I found out what my father meant on that video when he named an asset Vincent didn't know about. Everyone in that room, including me, believed my father's estate was a paid-off house worth maybe $400,000 and whatever was left in a savings account. That's what Vincent believed too, because Vincent had power of attorney and had looked, thoroughly, at everything he had authority over. But in 1998, when the shop was doing well, my mother made my father put the profits somewhere. She'd grown up poor and she didn't trust banks or husbands. So they set up an irrevocable trust in her name, funded it, and never touched it again. When the shop sold in 2009, that went in too. Vincent's power of attorney gave him authority over my father's personal accounts. It gave him no authority whatsoever over a trust he wasn't a trustee of, in an institution he'd never heard of, that generated statements to a P.O. box my father had kept for 26 years. $4.1 million. My father spent the last 3 years of his life letting his children believe he was a man with a house and a savings account, while a man in a machine shop savings sat in an account under my dead mother's name. You don't tell people who you are. You let the work tell them. Vincent contested it. Of course he did. 8 days later. Which triggered the no contest clause, which meant that the $1 he had been left was now $0, which is a detail I did not fully appreciate until his own attorney explained it to him in a hallway loud enough for me to hear. The contest failed in 14 months. It was never close. There is no argument against 51 minutes of video and a notary and 2 witnesses, one of whom was a hospice chaplain. But the contest was never the real thing. The real thing was Clause 5. The forensic accounting took 9 months. Between April 2021 and March 2025, Vincent Cole, acting under power of attorney, moved $612,000 out of our father's accounts. $290,000 of it went into a managed account at his own firm, generating fees payable to his own firm. $140,000 went out as loans to an LLC he was a member of, with no promissory note, no interest, and no repayment. $81,000 was reimbursement for caregiving coordination expenses, which is a category he invented, over a period during which he visited the house an average of once every 11 days. And $44,000 was paid to a consultant for estate planning services. Between 2021 and 2024. To plan an estate. That my father had already planned in 2019. The state securities regulator opened an investigation in the spring. He surrendered his registration in the fall rather than proceed to a hearing, which in that world is the same thing as losing it, except quieter. Cole Wealth Partners dissolved in 11 weeks. When a fiduciary loses his license, his clients don't wait around to hear the explanation. The criminal side is still moving as of this recording, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and it moves slowly, and I'm not going to speculate about how it ends. His wife filed in January. He sold the house with the view of the water in March. Claire kept her third. That's the part people ask me about most. She kept it because our father, who had every reason to be angry with her, understood something I'm still working on understanding, which is that Claire never had a plan. Claire had a big brother she was afraid of and a habit of agreeing out loud. She called me 8 months in. She wanted to talk about healing as a family. She said she'd been manipulated too. She said she never actually read the care agreement. And I said, and I thought about this for a long time before I said it. Claire, you didn't have to read it. You just had to say it was generous. We talk now. Maybe 4 times a year. It's not warm. It's not nothing. I still live in the house on Pratt Street. I put the $4.1 million into a fund and I take almost nothing out of it, because I don't actually want it and I never did, and that is the single strangest sentence in this entire story. I built a workshop in the garage. I do HVAC 3 days a week because I like it and I'd go insane without it. And in the second drawer of the bench there's a brass key ring with 4 keys to a building that's a vape store now. A man should be able to prove he built something. I've had a long time to think about what actually happened here, and I want to give you the honest version, not the satisfying one. My brother did not lose because I outsmarted him. I didn't. He beat me at every single stage. He got the power of attorney. He got the capacity evaluation. He got me thrown out of the house for 11 days and I sat in a motel room off Route 9 and cried in a parking lot because I was sure it was over. He lost for one reason. He was so completely certain that our father was furniture, that a slow man with shaking hands and a bad heart was a problem to be managed and not a person who was in the room. That he did all of it in front of him. He handed me that agreement at Thanksgiving with Dad 3 feet away. He put the lockbox on Dad's own front door. He scheduled the appointment for 4:40 and left the laminated card on the fridge. He never once thought about the audience, because he never once thought there was one. And there was. There was an old man with a gas station notebook writing down dates with a hand that could barely hold a pen. So here's what I'd say, if you're in the middle of something like this right now. The people who do this to a family always assume the same thing, that the quiet person is quiet because they have nothing. That the tired one is beaten. That the old one is gone. Sometimes that's true. And sometimes the quiet one is just still in the room, writing it down. My mother told my father, at the end of her life, that whichever child was still standing in the room when it got ugly would be the one who'd been telling the truth the whole time. I don't think she meant it as a prophecy. I think she meant it as instructions. And 30 years later, at 11 o'clock at night, with 11 hours left, my father followed them. If you've watched this far, I'd really like to know one thing. Has someone in your family ever assumed you were too quiet, too tired, or too far down the list to be paying attention, and found out otherwise? Tell me in the comments. I read them. That's not a line, I actually read them, and half the stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video like this one. If you want more of these, there's a new one twice a week. Subscribe so you get them. Thanks for staying to the end.